I grew up in a little tiny community in Arizona that was about a third Mexican and third Spanish speaking. So I was always aware of a Spanish speaking population, intensely curious about them. And then when I was an undergraduate, I was able to spend a couple of years in Mexico. I learned Spanish, or learned a good chunk of Spanish, and one thing led to another. I just became extremely fascinated by the area. My undergraduate degree was actually in music, but when I went to graduate school, I decided that I would major in something related to Spanish. And I went to UCLA. I originally started out in linguistics, but I got caught in a fight between a born-again Chomsky and an old-line structuralist, and decided that I really wanted to major in literature, and so literature was what I got my degree in. One of my instructors there, particularly my mentor, I almost would say, was a refugee from Argentina. And he got me very interested in Argentina, and then I decided to write my dissertation on Jorge Luis Borges. I was able to convince the Organization of American States that I could write this dissertation only if I went to Argentina and actually met with Borges. And so I went to Argentina and spent several months there, and was really captivated by the place. Borges has a line about, we don't really choose our subjects choose us. And that's very much what happened to me. I found myself captivated by the country, fascinated by the country, and I came back, and that was the country that I had most written on, and I have written 2 books on Argentina. So that's sort of the story of how I got where I was when I came to University of Texas.
And then what was your area of expertise when you assumed the directorship?
I was known as an Argentinist, as somebody who was particularly well known for writing on Argentina, and primarily 19th century Argentina. But I taught, my graduate courses were almost always about 19th century Latin America. Not always Argentina, but that was the area I was most interested in. And I would say that it was not just literature, it was also intellectual history. In fact, I would almost say mostly intellectual history.
This is an interesting question. How did U.S.-Latin American relations change during your tenure as director of LILAS? What challenges and opportunities did such changes present in the work of the Institute?
A lot happened. When I assumed directorship of the Institute, this was in 1995. In 1995, at a time was when something we called the Washington Consensus was very much in vogue throughout Latin America. Latin American countries had recently abandoned military dictatorships of different sorts. They'd embraced democracy. And as part of democracy, a lot of them embraced a kind of free market orientation that was known as the Washington Consensus. For various reasons throughout the region, this consensus went into crisis in the latter part of the 1990s. And so one of the things that most interested me was basically the collapse of the Argentine economy in 2001. Now, since then, there have been, throughout my continued directorship, there were a number of other changes, but I would say one of the biggest changes was the transition from military dictatorship to democracy, formulating new ways of building democracy, ways of building democracy that included indigenous minorities, for example, writing new constitutions in a number of countries. Then the loss of faith in this thing that we're calling the Washington Consensus, and then the adjustments that came after that. So a lot of my time at the Institute was framed by concerns of this sort.
What are some of the highlights and accomplishments during your directorship of which you are most proud? And you were talking about the gift that took it to the next.
Well, certainly one of the major accomplishments of the Institute at that time, and I want to say the Institute is not something that I take credit for, was the gift that we received from Joe and Terry Long, which resulted in a change of the name of the Institute. It went from the Institute of Latin American Studies to the Teresa Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies, and then from ILAS to LILAS, which is what it is called now. This was a very generous gift, and it was a very wonderful experience working with the Longs, because they're such wonderful people to begin with, but also planning how this gift would be used. And we were able to touch a number of different parts of the mission of the university through this gift. We had traveling fellowships for students, and I could give you a rather long list of students who went to Latin America because of Lozano Long traveling fellowships, and it really changed their lives. But we were also able to help graduate students through teaching assistantships. were able to attract and retain really good faculty through the Lozano Long professorships. So this was a major change in the Institute because we had resources we didn't have before. Now the Institute always did have resources. The Institute, all the time I was there, was a Title VI National Resource Center in Latin American Studies. And so we had money coming in from the federal government for different sorts of things. And being part of that group, being able to relate to other major institutions of Latin American studies throughout the country through the Title VI program was a wonderful experience. And that money was very, very helpful in a lot of ways in subsidizing our students. But without question, the most significant gift was the Lozano Long gift. Now, other items, we had a number of really wonderful people come through the Institute. Major writers like Tomás Eloy Martinez from Argentina visited us twice, I believe. Sylvie Malloy was one of the visitors, another Argentine writer. Jorge Castañeda, very well-known Mexican intellectual, was a guest of the Institute. Another guest of the Institute was Baltasar Garzón. This is the Spanish judge who was responsible largely for detaining Pinochet in England for several months, and in some way providing the catalyst that started the investigation of the human rights abuses that occurred during the Pinochet regime. So having him there was a great experience. Now, interestingly, he gave a wonderful talk, but the talk was not so much about how great he was. It was on the importance of international law. He gave this talk at the law school and did not mince words about, in his criticisms of the United States in not being fully participants or full participants in the international courts. So that was a great experience. After the collapse of the Argentine economy in 2001, we did a symposium on the Argentine crisis, and our keynote speaker was Paul Krugman, later on to win the Nobel Prize in Economics. And I will always remember Mr. Krugman for being so generous with his time. He didn't just do a cameo where he gave his talk and left, which is what a lot of famous people do, but he attended all of the sessions. He was an active participant in answers, in questions, in the discussions. So having people like that come through the Institute was a really, really great experience.
Next question. When or how did you realize that LILAS had international impact?
Well, I knew of Latin American studies at the University of Texas long before I went there. I was a graduate student at UCLA. I taught for 14 years at Yale before I went to the University of Texas. And everybody knew about the importance of Latin American studies at the University of Texas. This was partly because of the Institute. The Institute was very active, very visible with the Tinker professorships and other projects they took on. But then you also had the Vinson Library, which continues to be one of the leading Latin American collections in the entire country. So I knew of the importance of Latin American studies at the University of Texas long before I went there. Now, after I got there, of course, I realized how significant it was, and one of the great things about the University of Texas was the privileged place that Latin American studies has at that institution. I never needed to explain the importance of Latin American studies because the University of Texas as a whole knew that this was something they did very, very well, and it was something that had to be sustained.
One question. Is there an anecdote you would like to share that has stayed with you from your time as director, for example, memorable speakers or events, travel?
Well, the speakers I've mentioned were certainly major events. Whenever we'd invite a speaker like this, we would organize a symposium around the speaker. So those would be the kinds of events that I most remember as having a lot of intellectual impact. There were also funny events. I mean, I don't know if this wants to go, if anybody wants this. We had a visiting professor, one of the Lozano Long professors, in fact, who came to the University of Texas. He went to a conference in France and decided that as a gift to the Institute, he would bring back some French cheese. So he brought back the French cheese and decided there was no better place to store it than in his office. Well, I think this was on a Friday. Well, so he comes back to the Institute on Monday morning, and we have all of these workmen shining flashlights into the air conditioning ducts because we were convinced that something had died. So I don't know if that had a lot to do with Latin American studies, but it was one of the funnier things that happened while I was there.